The Gambia, a small West African nation that slithers through Senegal, is currently facing a political conundrum on whether or not to bring back female genital cutting, a practice that has been banned in the country since 2015. Female circumcision, which is also called female genital cutting or female genital mutilation depending on who you ask, has been a long-standing health issue since its inception in ancient Egypt and its spread to countries in Africa and across Asia. It involves the cutting of the external female genitalia to different extents, but all for non-medical reasons, and it is heavily associated with concepts of femininity, marriageability, and sexual chastity. The Mossi of Burkina Faso, for example, believed that the clitoris was a dangerous organ that can make men impotent, and in the Western world, American and English medicine of the 19th century believed that clitoridectomy was a cure for insanity, hysteria, and mania. However, female circumcision went beyond its function in the private life and had deep cultural roots and political implications for the societies in which it was practiced. It was viewed as an integral part of a girl's initiation into womanhood in places like Sierra Leone and the Gambia, and in other cultures it was a way to confirm gender identity. In societies that practice Islam, religion became a popular justification for female circumcision, as participants found support in misinterpreted scriptures. However, female circumcision in the way we see it today is not supported by the Islamic religion, and in a speech by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he stated that female circumcision is neither a requirement nor a sunnah, and it is impermissible based on the principle of do not harm yourself or others. In the early 1920s, when Protestant missionaries tried to ban female circumcision among its converts, describing it as an unchristian and barbaric custom, it was met with a lot of resistance. Kenya's dominant Kikuyu tribe quickly associated anti-FGC messages with colonization and the imposition of Western values onto their tradition. This led to cutting becoming a symbol of nationalism and independence from colonial forces, with Kenya's first president Jomo Kenyatta stating female circumcision could not be abandoned. He explains that it is impossible for a member of the tribe to imagine an initiation without clitoridectomy. Therefore, the abolition of the surgical element of this tradition means to the Kikuyu the abolition of the whole institution. This was not a widely shared sentiment, however, as many local women began to rally against the practice, highlighting its severe health risks. They said that some young girls suffered from extreme pain, shock, and hemorrhaging directly after the procedure, and in the long term were left with scarring, chronic infections, infertility, and issues in childbirth. During the era of decolonization, when many African nations regained their independence, these local women seized the winds of change to establish anti-FGC campaigns. The women of the Upper Volta in modern-day Burkina Faso used radio broadcasts to oppose FGC as early as 1975 due to their heightened political awareness. On a similar boat in 1983, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front launched a health-focused campaign to eradicate harmful traditional practices, including FGC. A year later, in a move to coordinate their local campaigns, African women established the Inter-African Committee on Traditional Practices Affecting the Health of Women and Children, an organization that continues to operate today. However, progress was very slow, as African nations who were pinned down by neo-colonialism did not support these campaigns, and the international community viewed it as a domestic cultural matter rather than a global medical issue, as we can see in the World Health Organization's decision to not look into FGC in 1958. And in response to the health concerns raised, the supporters of the tradition argued for medicalization rather than eradication. This saw female circumcision still happening, just under clinical conditions with the use of anesthesia. However, during the 1970s and 80s, the issue of FGC gained traction when it was picked up by the women's rights movement in the West. What was previously considered a health issue was quickly reframed as an attack on women's sexuality and bodily autonomy, and the relatively neutral terms like genital cutting or female circumcision were replaced by the far more emotive term female genital mutilation. Influential articles by Gloria Steinem, Mary Daly, and Nawal al-Saadawi heightened international awareness on the matter, describing it as a denial of women's sexual freedom and prompting the World Health Organization to address the issue for the first time. Here, female circumcision became a symbol of imperial patriarchy for Western feminists, and the clitoris, in contrast, represented women's freedom and was viewed as the mutilation to end all mutilations. It was the subject of numerous films, books, campaigns, and documentaries, often portraying African women as either silent victims of male dominance or as cruel tormentors of their daughters. Feminist philosopher Susan Moller even argued that some women might be better off if the cultures into which they were born in were to be extinct, so that the members could be integrated into a less sexist surrounding culture. These media portrayals were seen as humiliating to many African women because their private parts were photographed and put on display like spectacles. These tensions surfaced during the UN Women's Conference in Copenhagen in 1980, which was boycotted by African women who held their own panel on FGC at the same time. They did this to call out Western feminists for their condescending and insensitive approach to female circumcision, with an attendee saying that it has become quite fashionable to talk about circumcision, but these white-collar intellectuals know nothing of these things. Why do they always want to talk about circumcision? Women in these regions have many more serious problems. The Association of African Women for Research and Development issued a statement after the conference to warn people about this new crusade of the West and the ill-timed interference, maternalism, and misuse of power in their work on FGC. And because the issue was framed as savage customs from backward African and Arab cultures, African women who had been advocating for the abolition of these practices for health reasons felt the need to somewhat defend the custom. In another account of the conference, Ghanaian activist Afua Dokinun recalls that East African delegates coming from Sudan and Somalia were less reactionary due to their long campaign history, whereas delegates from West Africa were shocked at what they saw as Western neo-colonialist interests. But despite their attempts to save women in the global south, al-Saadawi asserts that Western women were also mentally circumcised through the use of chastity belts, and states that female circumcision is no different culturally from the cosmetics and hair dyes that is forced on Western women by the media and beauty commercials. In recent years, Australian academic Theodore Bennet built on al-Saadawi's point, saying cosmetic surgeries reinforce the same ideals that FGC does, yet one is admonished whilst the other is viewed as free choice. He argues that, like FGC, cosmetic surgeries seem to have the sole purpose of enhancing women's sexual desirability in the context of the male gaze, and it generates similar health risks as female circumcision. He believes that due to the presence of overt and covert social pressures to conform to certain physical ideals in both societies, the validity of women's consent to cosmetic surgery and FGC procedures are questionable. Another way that women from the global south have been alienated in the anti-FGC movement is the hyper-focus on sexuality and the misconception that circumcision prevents sexual pleasure.
This is an uncut clitoris, and this is a cut clitoris. As you can see, the part that is cut is the tip of the organ, the glans, more or less the body of the clitoris. But all these other structures that are around the vagina are still there, and they can respond to sexual stimuli.
So while African women may seem mutilated to a Western audience, it rarely aligns with the real-life experiences of circumcised women. It instead comes from the desire to sensationalize and highlight the differences between us and them in a way that reinforces Western cultural superiority. Some anti-FGC activists say that even the term female genital mutilation needs to be reconsidered.
People about female cutting, and they hear mutilation, they see a woman as being totally disfigured and disgusting. Now, how a woman looks underneath her clothes is for her to know and no one else. And I just feel that degrading a woman by that terminology is just not healthy.
Today, approximately 100 to 140 million women and girls are thought of to have undergone some form of the procedure, with an additional 2 million girls at risk each year. Local campaigns are increasingly merging the rights and the health perspective to help those at risk, and reframing the international discourse about female circumcision so it doesn't demonize participants, but rather encourages them to abandon the practice. We see the positive outcomes in places such as Uganda, where the Sabini elders, who were staunch defenders of FGC, decided to abandon the practice in the late 1990s. They continue to have initiation ceremonies by singing and dancing and feasting, but they have cut out the surgical element of the ceremony and have said that the educational approach is the most effective way to end FGC. The Totsins program in Senegal also sets out to educate locals on women's rights and the health risks associated with female circumcision, giving each community the power to collectively decide whether or not to abandon the practice. As a result of these educational programs, 2,336 villages in Senegal, 298 in Guinea, and 23 in Burkina Faso have chosen to abandon FGC since 1997. Before programs like this, many men in these villages stated they were unaware of the links between female circumcision and women's health issues. Once they understood these connections and realized why some of their daughters had died, they actively participated in these campaigns to eliminate the practice. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time.